Hello and welcome into another episode of Preps to Pros. I'm Cooper Petagna alongside Andrew Ivins as always, and we got a lot to get to this week, episode 17 of the Oyster Boys. And Drew, what a huge weekend for the Sun Belt. We're going to be talking a little bit about Notre Dame, their recruiting implications after their loss to Marshall, and the man that handed them that loss, Charles Huff. Is he going to be a guy that's going to be a popular name in this next year's coaching cycle? We'll also talk about Scott Frost, the first dismissal of the year after the Cornhuskers lose to Georgia Southern. We'll hit it on a 2-minute drill, talk a little bit about LSU, Notre Dame, and Iowa found a 2024 quarterback. But Drew, the Sun Belt, I mean, what a weekend, my man. We got App State, Georgia Southern, Marshall, revenge of the G5, my man.
Old Dominion last week as well. They're part of the Sun Belt. You know, it was a crazy weekend of college football. If you went and saw Arch Manning play on Friday night, and that's not even part of the show, like, it's got to be a wild weekend. And week two, it looked kind of the schedule. You're like, and then it doesn't disappoint. College football. What is the term Pate uses? Any given Saturday. We saw some of that in week two.
Hey, shout out to the social media of the Oyster Boys. Drew, you texted me, congratulations, but over 1 million views. Can you believe that? The number one player in the country. That's what he does. If you missed that on Friday night, Arch Manning had himself a game. We'll recap that a little bit later in the week. But Drew, let's get right to it. We're going to start this show off with some juice. And I believe you put a crystal ball in on 2023 athlete Edwin Joseph. What is the latest you're hearing with him?
Well, I think Edwin Joseph's a name a lot of people need to know. He's quickly turned into one of the hottest recruits in South Florida. He's there at Chaminade Madonna Prep playing alongside two really good juniors in Jeremiah Smith and JoJo Trader. So Edwin's kind of been the forgotten guy. This season, his coaches are playing him on both sides of the ball. He's working at wide receiver. He's working at defensive back. After that 3-game cut made the rounds, Miami offered him a scholarship. Florida State offered him a scholarship, and Louisville offered him a scholarship. All three of those schools like him on defense. He was in Coral Gables on Friday night with both of his parents. From what I've heard, Miami's going to be very, very hard to beat for Edwin Joseph. They like him a lot. They think he can play in that secondary for them. They think he's a guy with a ton of tools, 6 foot, 170 pounds. But there are two schools I would keep an eye on, Penn State and Utah. Both those programs like Edwin as a wide receiver. Sounds like he could take some visits, but as of right now, I like the Hurricanes for Edwin Joseph, who is one of the biggest risers in South Florida.
Importance of the senior tape right there, like you mentioned, with Edwin Joseph. But Drew, let's go to another guy in the state of Florida. That is 4-star safety and Ohio State commit Cedric Hawkins. And there's been a little bit of buzz. He went on a visit to Auburn, but where do things stand with Ohio State and Cedric Hawkins right now?
Cedric's a guy that hasn't done many interviews. He did sneak up to Auburn back during the summer months for an official visit. I was at his game on Friday night. St. Thomas Aquinas hosted Coco and Cedric Hawkins. Hawkins played both ways, man. I thought he was excellent. 8 tackles on defense, caught 6 passes on offense. We never saw him go both ways, even on the 7-on-7 circuit, so that's encouraging. But after the game, I had a chance to catch up with him, ask him about his recruitment. He told me, yeah, I liked my Auburn visit, but I'm locked in with Ohio State. He was there for the Notre Dame game over Labor Day weekend. I'll also add this, Florida State, they had a DB coach at that game on Friday night. I asked him about the Seminoles. He made it seem like he's somewhat, I don't know if the word intrigued is out there. Maybe he's listening to FSU, but he kept saying he's locked in with Ohio State. And I know some people up in Columbus are fired up about Cedric Hawkins. So I kind of maybe would write off Auburn here. And if there is a school that has a chance at flipping him, it might be Florida State and Mike Norvell, who's 2-0.
All right, Drew, let's stick with Florida State now. And you brought this up in pre-production. We kind of slipped it in there, but top 247 receiver Jaylen Brown, who was committed to Brian Kelly in the LSU Fighting Tigers. Florida State has a visit, I believe, to Texas A&M and College Station this upcoming weekend. Is he on the verge of maybe kind of looking around a little bit?
I don't know if he's going to open up his recruitment, Jaylen Brown, but I do think he's going to go through the entire recruiting process. You know, this summer he was out in Baton Rouge, ended up committing to Brian Kelly and that coaching staff. And he said he was going to take visits, and that's proven to be true. Friday night, I was at his game as well, Gulliver Prep, Chaminade, or at Cardinal Gibbons. Mike Norvell was on the sidelines. Mike Norvell keeping a close eye on Jaylen Brown from what I could tell. And, he's going to take a visit, an official this weekend to Texas A&M. I think that's certainly notable. The Aggies seem to be trying to reinforce that wide receiver room, figure some things out there. Yes, Evan Stewart, he's getting some run as a freshman, but they're in on it for a number of elite pass catchers. Jaylen Brown's the latest. I'll finish here with Jaylen Brown. Talking to his dad this morning, he brought up that they're one of the big reasons why they're going out to College Station is because they're not only going to be able to see Texas A&M play, but they're also going to be able to see Miami, Josh Gaddis, Mario Cristobal, and that offense play. So, Florida State's in there, Texas A&M's in there. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe Florida eventually got involved, but it seems like a ways to go with Jaylen Brown and his recruitment.
I thought about that with Miami, and for Miami's coaching staff, seeing what you just saw with the Aggies and Appalachian State, you're probably encouraging Jaylen Brown to take that trip and say, hey, go ahead, go check out the Aggies. We'll find a way to pick up the W while you're there in College Station. But Drew, let's get to the elephant in the room as we transition in something that we talked about weeks ago, Drew, the hypothetical conversation of what if Marcus Freeman is not what we think he is? And in terms of what he's done on the recruiting trail, he's been second to none in terms of the first-year head coaches. But as a coach at Notre Dame, he is the first coach for the Irish to start his era 0-3, a loss to Oklahoma State last year. In the postseason, he starts this year with a loss in Columbus at Ohio State, and then a 20.5-point favorite against Marshall. Marshall comes in and wins that game 26-21. Andrew, a lot to unpack here, but I want to get to you and your just initial takeaways, what you saw out of this game and what it might mean for the Irish going forward.
Well, I do think it might be time to panic here a little bit, and I say that because I don't really know what Notre Dame wants to do on offense. You watch the Ohio State game, right? They were super conservative. Seems like they just wanted it to be in that game and keep it close for as long as they could, which is what they did. Against Marshall, there's just no identity. Is this a power running football team? Do they want to throw the football? I think the most alarming stat, and I know we're going to get into the whole quarterback situation, is through 2 games, Notre Dame's wide receivers have caught 12 passes for 199 yards and 0 touchdowns. There's just no dynamic playmakers on the field. It seems very vanilla. Michael Mayer is obviously an elite tight end. He continues to produce, but he's getting double teamed, and it just seems like there's no creativity on that side of the ball. And I think it's a major issue, and I think that's going to make things difficult for Notre Dame this season. And we did say it, Cooper, Marcus Freeman's been billed as this recruiting god. Well, what happens if he lost some games? I mean, the honeymoon's over. He has lost games. He's 0-2, and there's a difficult schedule that lies ahead.
Well, we talked about it, and if you're just tuning into this show, earlier the news that came out of South Bend, it's just getting worse there in terms of starting quarterback Tyler Buckner. He's going to be out 4 months, which is the rest of the regular season, with a high-grade sprain to his non-throwing shoulder. So now Marcus Freeman is going to have to rally around second-string quarterback Drew Pine, who came in and struggled in limited time on Saturday against Marshall. But for me, Drew, I'm with you in terms of what we've seen out of that offense and offensive coordinator Tommy Rees. Even coming into the season, the receiver group was a big question mark, but you thought you would be getting more production out of the running back room, especially with Chris Tyree, who I believe only has 12 touches on the entire season, only had 5 touches last game against the Thundering Herd. So that's been a question mark. But Drew, let's take a look at the big picture from 30,000 feet. And at the quarterback position, you have Tyler Buckner as a true sophomore, Drew Pine as a junior. But the Irish don't have a quarterback committed in this class. They pushed all their chips in on top 247 quarterback Dante Moore from the state of Michigan, Martin Luther King. He ends up pivoting in really kind of surprising a lot of people, but committing to Dan Lanning in the Oregon Ducks. We've seen Notre Dame kind of throw their hat in multiple races, whether that's been Avery Johnson or other places as well at the quarterback position. Now, they have C.J. Carr, who's one of the best players in 2024, committed. But, Drew, I mean, you're sitting here right now as a Notre Dame fan. Is this a cause for concern that you don't have the guy not only on your roster right now, but you don't have him in next year's cycle either?
I think it's just total miscalculation from that offensive staff and Tommy Rees. I mean, remember last year was Jack Cohen was the quarterback. I was reading this morning on our Notre Dame site that the Irish didn't even know if he was going to have 1 or 2 years when they took him from Wisconsin as a transfer. Well, he only had 1, and now we're seeing what they have to do with these quarterbacks. To me, the fact that they don't have a 2023 arm committed is super alarming. I mean, I'm banking on the fact that C.J. Carr, who Cooper, me and you both really like in the class of 2024, hoping he hits. I mean, CJ Carr is probably 2 or 3 years away from being able to win games on Saturdays. And I know we like him. I see some Davis Mills in him. I think he's got all the tools. There are some rumors out there that he could potentially reclassify. But to me, I mean, why did Notre Dame not go on Avery Johnson? I was watching some of his clips the other night from what he's doing. He's just a dynamic talent at quarterback that can, a member of my freaks list, so he can run the football, he can spin it around, and it seems like Notre Dame kind of kicked the tires on him, flirted with him, exchanged some text messages, but never asked him out on the date. And I think that's a huge mistake, and I think that we're going to come back a few months from now and look back on this being one of the bigger storylines just nationally in the 2023 cycle. How did Notre Dame botch this quarterback situation? All in on Dante Moore, right? Then they pivot to CJ Carr, but they kind of forgot about the class of 2023. And I think that's what's concerning when we talk about this offense and big picture.
All in on Dante Moore, not to mention that they were in the mix for top 247 quarterback and Clemson commit Christopher Vizina, who's a guy that we really liked all throughout this process and has continued to develop throughout his senior year. They were in good standing there. They end up investing all their resources into Dante Moore. He chooses to go elsewhere, and now it's Notre Dame who's left at the altar in the 2023 quarterback cycle. But Drew, sticking with Notre Dame and the Irish, you think about the implications here on the recruiting trail. One of the best classes in the country, sitting at number 4 in 2023, with the top class in the country in 2024. I mean, I'm looking at some of the names on top of their board right now, starting with top 247 safety Peyton Bowen, a guy who's flirted with Oklahoma and Texas A&M. Notre Dame battling to keep him in the class. And then you have Charles Jagasaw, another top 32 prospect, but Christian Gray, who they beat head-to-head on LSU with. Also, Braylon James, a very similar story as well. These were highly sought-out prospects for Marcus Freeman. That's kind of been the feather in his cap early on in the Freeman era at Notre Dame. Do you spell trouble here in Notre Dame being able to keep these type of top 150 prospects in the boat?
So I don't, and why? I covered Notre Dame a few years ago, and it's always been the same thing. Notre Dame recruits a specific type of student athlete. And yes, we saw Keon Keeley back off a long-time commitment to Notre Dame just a few months ago. To me, I think most of these guys are going to stick. Maybe there'll be 1 or 2 defections. I just think it changes kind of the narrative around Notre Dame, this 0-2 start. You go from trying to get Keon Keeley back to having to play defense with some of these other guys. And Notre Dame, they did most of their official visits in the summer. So now you're not even sure if those guys are for sure going to get back on campus. I just wonder what happens, though, if the losses start to mount up. I mean, this schedule, they got Cal coming to town this weekend, eventually play North Carolina. I mean, can Notre Dame score with North Carolina? BYU, that feels like a loss. Syracuse looks very improved. I mean, everyone had that as a W. Is that now a toss-up? I just, if Marcus Freeman goes 7-5, 6-6, maybe this 2023 class sticks, but what happens in 2024? That's where you're really looking for that first-year bump on the recruiting trail. So will certainly be interesting. But I'm not panicking just yet. I just think it, kind of restricts what they can do as they try to round out that 2023 group.
I'm preaching patience, but I'm a little bit concerned if I'm a Notre Dame fan right now. To me, the lights have looked too big for Marcus Freeman on the gridiron. And I think that was the biggest concern coming into the Marcus Freeman era, was the inexperience. I think we've seen that play out through the first 3 games. And even the recruiting, as good as it's been, I think it's going to take a hit here. And I mentioned those guys. Peyton Bowen is certainly a guy that I have my eyes on. Christian Gray as well, and Braylon James in a very competitive recruiting territory in Texas. So Marcus Freeman certainly has his work cut out for him the rest of the season and on the recruiting trail, as now Notre Dame not doing themselves any favors. But Drew, we're going to learn a lot in the next 4 weeks with Notre Dame. They got Cal coming to town, a Cal team that is 2-0, who I'm very familiar with during my time at Washington. Justin Wilcox, one of the best defensive minds in the country. Notre Dame, before that news, to Tyler Buckner, 11-point favorite in that game. I would not be surprised if that's going to be a very competitive football game. After that, Drew, you mentioned they go on the road at Chapel Hill, Drake May in North Carolina, a very high-powered offense, and then BYU, neutral field in Las Vegas, and then Stanford coming to town. So listen, they got to find a way to really string some wins together over the next couple weeks, seize back some momentum, and kind of right the ship. But right now, a lot more questions than answers in South Bend. So time to buckle down for Marcus Freeman. We will certainly be keeping an eye on that. We're not done. We're going to talk a little bit about more of him in the show. But Andrew, let's talk about a guy that I would say that I don't want to say identify, but you've been a fan of for quite some time, and that's Marshall head coach Charles Huff, who's undoubtedly coming off the biggest win in his tenure at Marshall in his second year now, 2-0, 9-6 overall, led Marshall to a 7-6 season last year, where they lost the New Orleans Bowl to Billy Napier and the Louisiana Lafayette Raging Cajuns. But Drew, you like so much of what Charles Huff is doing, and now with Scott Frost, who we'll get to here in a quick minute. But you think Charles Huff could be a very popular name in this year's coaching cycle?
Well, I thought he should have been one last year when he went 7-6, signed the number 1 ranked recruiting class in the AAC in his first year. This is a guy that's been touched by a lot of good head coaches. He's worked for Nick Saban. He's worked for James Franklin. He's worked for PJ Fleck. He's young. He played, and he can recruit. I think that's the most important thing. I spent about an hour with Charles Huff back in January at Miami Edison High School, just hanging out with him, kind of writing a profile on him and just learning about him, his vision, what he wants to do. And he told me at Marshall, I don't have the manpower we did at Alabama, but I'm still treating Marshall like it's Alabama. And he's got an Alabama former assistant strength coach running that program. He's got a recruiting department like Alabama. And I think the thing people don't realize about that win at Notre Dame is he did that with a transfer quarterback because his starter, Grant Wells, transferred to Virginia Tech, and he had to go find someone in the portal. I think Charles Huff, from everything I've seen, this is a guy that can get the job done when it comes to talent acquisition, not only when it comes to recruiting, but also when it comes to the transfer portal. He gets modern day roster management, and that's the biggest thing right now. So I do think he's a guy that's going to get linked to a lot of these different openings. He should have last year. I think Virginia Tech would have been a good landing spot for him. So interested to see what his name gets linked to, who gets involved with him, because I think the future is very bright for Charles Huff.
Originally from that Maryland area. But yeah, I mean, you look at Marshall's roster and how they've shaped that roster, 24 transfer portal additions this offseason. They played 87 players in week 1 against Norfolk State. So you're looking at that resume and look at the experience that he has. I mean, he worked very closely with James Franklin, not only at Vanderbilt, but at Penn State. Worked with PJ Fleck with a quick cup of coffee there at Western Michigan, with the Buffalo Bills under Chan Gailey, and then, of course, under Nick Saban, one of his most recent stops, in Mississippi State before that. But Drew, I mean, the recruiting resume, right, what it comes down to, you got to win games as well. Dallas Turner at Alabama, Ja'Cory Brooks as well from the Florida area, and then Saquon Barkley at Penn State. Drew, can you get a little bit more in the weeds in terms of what is the perception of Charles Huff, the recruiter?
Well, he was the 24/7 Sports Recruiter of the Year in 2021, and that's the cycle he landed Dallas Turner and Ja'Cory Brooks. And I talked with Charles Huff about that Dallas Turner recruitment. Everyone thought Dallas Turner was probably going to end up at Georgia, and he ended up signing with Alabama. And Charles Huff told me, he's like, I didn't really even talk to Dallas Turner. No, I talked to Dallas Turner's dad, and that's how I won that recruitment over. They were both in the same fraternity in college, obviously at different schools, but that's the angle he worked and the relationship he worked. And in this story I wrote, and I was tweeting about it all weekend after that Marshall win, Huff has the key to the city in Miami. He is being embraced by that community. They trust him. Local coaches, local community leaders, local neighborhoods, they know if they send their kid to go play for Charles Huff, he's going to look after them and he's going to make sure that they succeed. And that's the big thing in South Florida. Yeah, you can play and you can be from South Florida, but if you didn't ride that yellow bus, you need someone that's going to bring you in. Charles Huff didn't ride the yellow bus, but someone has brought him in and they've accepted him. And I think that's going to be huge wherever he ends up. Yeah, sure. At Marshall, he's getting kids from South Florida. But if he were to go to a Nebraska, if he were to go to a Georgia Tech, wherever he lands, they are going to be a force in the 305 on the recruiting trail.
Charles Huff in his second year. He looked like the better coach on Saturday, and at times Marshall looked like the more athletic team, played to their tempo, made Notre Dame play their style of football. So hats off to Charles Huff. We'll be keeping an eye on him. West Virginia, Neil Brown, 0-2 start. They lose their latest game to Kansas after losing to Pittsburgh in week 1. So West Virginia, who knows, maybe that opens up and spells doom for Neil Brown. Charles Huff, a logical option there. But, Drew, here we are already. What are we, week 2? We're talking about the coaching cycle already. And I think Mondays of our show are going to be a little bit more negative, per se, in terms of the outlook and maybe how some of these teams are going to adjust and talking about the future. Wednesday, we're going to reward some of these teams that played well over the weekend, do a deep dive on their recruiting class. But one of those teams that's been in the dumps for way too long, that is Nebraska. They fire their head coach, Scott Frost, 5 seasons in. His record there, 16-31, a $15 million buyout that would have dropped to $7.5 million on October 1st. And they said, the heck with it, we'll do it right now. So Scott Frost out at Nebraska after another embarrassing loss to Georgia Southern at the hands of Clay Helton, the former USC head coach. Kudos to him and the Georgia Southern staff. They did a great job on Saturday getting that win in Lincoln. But, Drew, where do we even begin with Nebraska and the Cornhuskers?
Well, them deciding to do it now instead of later shows to me that they're committed to getting this program right, and they're committed to spending money. So my question to you, Cooper, if you are running this search, who's the first guy that you call?
Well, I'm glad you brought it up, Drew. But I'm a Luke Fickle guy, have been through and through. We've talked about it on this show. And you could go back, and we're talking a lot about Notre Dame. I could not believe Notre Dame did not hire Luke Fickle. To me, that was a slam dunk, missed opportunity there. We're only 3 games into the Marcus Freeman era, so we're going to give him a little bit of time. But Nebraska, you have the opportunity to right that wrong. I'm looking at Luke Fickle's buyout. I could not believe it. $3.5 million. Right. So I think Luke Fickle is a guy that's committed to the University of Cincinnati. I think it's going to be really hard to pluck him out of there. But I think Luke Fickle thought there would be more opportunity for him. Ohio State with Ryan Day, a contract extension recently. The same with James Franklin and Penn State. You look at some of the schools in the Big Ten that he would be options in that area as well. Notre Dame with Marcus Freeman. Right. So now Nebraska is in this kind of advantageous situation now, making this decision early on. They have some time to work some back channels with some of these top tier coaches, Luke Fickle being one of them. But he would be my first call. And Drew, the only reason I thought about this, I mean, outside of the fact that it makes so much sense, but they just paid $15 million where they could have waited a couple weeks and easily paid half of that. So the Big Ten, obviously the dawn of the super conferences, I don't think money is going to be an issue. I think Luke Fickle is the guy that gives Nebraska the best chance to win and build a championship caliber program where I don't know if there's even 1 or 2 other people that could do that would be somewhat available. So Luke Fickle to Nebraska, listen, I think he loves where he is at Cincinnati. I think he loves the fact that they're going to go to the Big 12. I think Cincinnati in that area, that 300-mile radius, is a more of a fertile recruiting ground. So you really have to sell that if you're Nebraska. But that is my one make you say no candidate for the Nebraska Cornhuskers.
And I think with Luke Fickle, I mean, you started touching on it there with the 300-mile radius, is you can develop players. And at Nebraska, you don't have a ton of talent in your backyard. This year, it's actually a really good year in the state. Malachi Coleman, remember my Freaks list, top 247 athlete, kid that can do a little bit of everything. It's kind of an uptick of a year, but you don't normally have Malachi Colemans walking around and within an hour drive of your campus and guys like that you can get. So to me, you got to have someone that can develop talent. I think Luke Fickle definitely fits that mold. How many guys did he have drafted last year? 9. He's going to have more selected this year. So I like that thought process. Kind of sticking along the same lines for me, Cooper. My first call would be the guy we talked about last week, Coach Prime. Why not Deion Sanders? You know, we mentioned on the show last week that we think he's ready to take over at a Power 5 program. And I think with Dion, kids would go to Nebraska to play for him. And if they're going to Jackson State right now, there's going to be no issues with them going to Lincoln and listening to him. And if you didn't hear us last week talk about Deion Sanders, the amount of changes he has made at Jackson State in terms of building out that support staff with analysts, in terms of bringing in better coaches, improving the weight room. It would be exciting to see what he did with the Cornhuskers, and I think he would elevate their recruiting. And more importantly, Deion Sanders has quickly learned how to navigate that transfer portal. I'm not saying he's the king of the transfer portal. It seems like that title gets thrown around a lot. It used to be Manny Diaz. Now I think Lincoln Riley might be the king of the transfer portal. But Deion Sanders is well versed in getting 1 and 2 year rentals and allowing them to produce. And I think at Nebraska, you're going to need a little influx of talent. So Deion Sanders is a guy I would call entertain. I'm not saying you have to make him say no, but just entertain it, listen to it, see his vision, and maybe that's your guy.
Deion's got some gravity to him, a lot of gravity to him. I think he's proved that. We talked about it last show, but Deion Sanders is going to have a hot market as a head coaching candidate at the Power 5 level. And I think, listen, I talked about it on last show. I think the fortune favors the bold here, and I don't really even think it's a risk. Maybe it's a calculated risk with a guy like Deion Sanders who's only coached at the current level that he's at. But I think at a place like Nebraska, you're sitting there and you're looking around and say, where have we been successful in terms of recruiting? And you look at a guy like Deion Sanders, you're more playing for the coach. And that's very rare to have that type of personality that I think not only are you recruiting with, but you can attract a lot of talent in coaching circles as well. We've seen him do that. I think a lot of people want to work for Deion Sanders as well because they believe in his vision. In Lincoln, Nebraska, with all due respect to that part of the country, the one thing that they have going for them, in my mind, here's this program that's getting off to a battered start. I'm watching them struggle against Georgia Southern. Their coach is on the ropes. Their beloved son, Scott Frost, and that place is packed. I've never seen a more passionate fan base in the country than Nebraska. Those people there in that community deserve a winner. And I love Deion Sanders' vision from 30,000 feet. And I think this is a guy that would be an outside-the-box hire, but would certainly benefit Nebraska to bring in somebody like Deion Sanders to help them transition into the new era of college football. I think he'd be a perfect fit there, Drew, and I'm glad you brought it up. But, Drew, a couple other names that come up, that we think about when it comes to Nebraska. Mark Stoops has been a hot name. Matt Campbell has been a hot name. Matt Rule as well. Dave Doran from NC State. Lance Leopold with a big win last week against West Virginia. Kansas certainly trending in the right direction, and Jonathan Smith from Oregon State. Those are some of the names that me and you have thrown together, and not to mention Charles Huff is probably going to be another guy that gets a look. But I think Nebraska, if they played this the right way, and I think we saw this with Florida, maybe not as early with Dan Mullen, but you got a head start, and you got to make it count. So one of those guys at the top, Stoops, Fickle, Deion Sanders, Matt Campbell, Matt Rule, I think you'd be elated if you're a Nebraska fan there. But let's turn to Scott Frost and kind of say what happened to him, a guy that had so much success in an area of the country that you are very familiar with at Central Florida. He goes to Nebraska. Everybody thinks this is a slam dunk, not only on the field, but perceptionally it isn't. And after 5 years, not even a third of the way through his 5th season, he's out in Lincoln. And now you kind of say, what happens to Scott Frost? I know me and you have a couple different ideas of maybe where Scott Frost's next opportunity is, but I'll let you take the first hack at it.
Is he the offensive coordinator at Alabama next year? I mean, Bill O'Brien, does he take a job and we see Scott Frost go to the Nick Saban School of Coaching Rehab? I think that's certainly a possibility. And I hope he lands on his feet. It's just wild. I mean, what if he had stayed at UCF? UCF is now transitioning to the Big 12. They have all this energy, all this momentum. Obviously, Gus Malzahn's doing a great job, but what if Scott Frost had kept that thing going and ripping and roaring? I mean, they could be a power. We talk about all these teams leaving the Big 12. UCF could be a perennial top 25 program if they had stayed and Scott Frost was still engineering it. So I expect him to either do the TV thing or go call plays for someone somewhere. And I think Alabama would certainly make sense. I mean, there's probably some other programs out there. I think you tossed out UCLA working for Chip Kelly. So I think he'll have no shortage of options.
he needs a cleanse. Like it worked for Sarkisian so far, what we're seeing. I think the barometer on Saturday for Texas playing Alabama very closely at home. I think Texas is heading in the right direction. I think that's safe to say. We'll see. But I look at Scott Frost, and it's a very similar situation. If that opportunity is there at Alabama, I think you have to take it, and not from an X's and O's standpoint, but how to run a program, what it takes to run a program, everything that goes into it. I think that's where Saban has really earned so much respect from people like Steve Sarkisian, Lane Kiffin, who have gone through this process and have now found new success. So I think Alabama certainly offers that opportunity. But how about this one, Drew? A little bit of outside the box here, and I want to get your thoughts on this one. But what about Clemson? What about Clemson with a first-year offensive coordinator? DJ Uiagalelei has sputtered at times. Got off to a good start this last week against Furman, but that's certainly not going to be the team that you're going to write home about in terms of trying to figure out what expectations are going to be for that offense. But I look at Clemson and I look at the culture. I look at Dabo Swinney. He has a particular way of doing things. And, a lot of the criticism at Clemson has been, and, he promotes from in-house, right? In a lot of these internal candidates, and he's not very open-minded to external thought processes and ideas. Scott Frost is a very, very intelligent offensive mind, and one that I think they could use at a place like Clemson. And more than that, I think Scott Frost could use the tutelage under a guy like Dabo Swinney to see what a culture and how you build one. He would need some time there. But, Drew, I think it makes sense, a little outside the box. I don't see it happening, but interested to get your thoughts on that.
No, I would love that. I think it's the best for both worlds. I mean, Clemson, yeah, sure, against Furman, they put up some points, but that offense kind of did sputter at times, and I think that might be the case the entire season. And Bud Elliott, our colleague, he brought up the fact that we've gotten to the point where Dabo has promoted within so much that none of these guys really have play calling duties, or they've never done it before. So bringing in someone that has all that experience could maybe unlock Clemson's offense. We keep thinking Cade Klubnik's going to be the guy, but what if it's just a different play caller or a different set of eyes up in the booth or a different guy drawing and scheming it up? So I'm all for that. If Scott Frost also wants to come down and coach at Florida Atlantic like Lane Kiffin did for a year, I'm not going to push back on that. But again, I think he's going to have plenty of options.
Only week 2, we got the Oyster Boy conspiracy theories already ripping and roaring. Off to a great start. And Drew, we're going to transition to the 2-minute drill now. But before we do that, make sure you at home, if you haven't done so already, subscribe to the 24/7 Sports YouTube channel, not page. Make sure you throw us a like and leave a comment as well. Guys, we are incredibly pleased with the feedback that we have gotten. Our show producer, Jesse, Andrew, doing a great job. So we're going to try to continue to build on this momentum. Now our 4-minute offense is done. Now it's time for the 2-minute drill. Drew, you always got very interesting and kind of like out of pocket. Just where did that come from? 2-minute drill hits. And I love this one that you got because I think it makes a lot of sense for a team right now struggling to find their identity on offense.
Yeah, Iowa, you say struggling. I mean, they've scored 1 touchdown in 8 quarters of football here in 2022. They got a quarterback commitment over the weekend from a guy who I think can unlock some things or allow Iowa potentially to make the transition to a more modernized attack with some RPOs. And the kid is James Resar. He is out of the Duval area, Bishop Kenny High School. It's actually where John Walford, who is now with the Rams, went to school. I love this kid. Multiple sub-11 times in the 100-meter dash. Actually played last season with a broken leg for most of it. He had a little hairline fracture in the leg. Didn't know about it, but this is a guy, again, he can beat you with his arm, he can beat you with his legs, and to me, Iowa, they need to find something different. They need to get weird on offense or get modern on offense, and I think James Resar, yeah, he's 2 years away from getting there, but if there's ever a time to make the transition and embrace something new and actually try to score a bunch of points, I think James Resar allows you to do that. So a commitment over the weekend that not many people saw, but James Resar, he was up there. He went to Iowa State, saw the struggles on offense, came back home, flew home, and decided he wants to sign with the Hawkeyes at some point down the line. So I love this take again. Interested to see how it works out because I think James Resar is one of the better kept secrets and when it comes to quarterbacks in that 2024 cycle.
Drew, we need a hashtag get weird on offense a shirt in the merchandise store. We don't have a merchandise store. Maybe we can throw that idea to Peyton, see if he'll pick it up. But Drew, my 2-minute drill, what I'm going to stick with here, I think you look at Notre Dame and you look at LSU, and I've been watching LSU very closely the last 2 weeks, and you can tell that this is a acclimation period for both coaches, not only Brian Kelly, but Marcus Freeman as well. And I thought there was going to be a little bit of trade-off. I thought LSU was getting somebody that was going to come in and instill discipline and structure into a program that very much needed it so. And right now, what we're seeing is not a program struggling, but this period, like I said, an acclimation period to where they're trying to clean up so many things. And I think guys are learning new habits, and Rome wasn't built in a day. So I think the expectations year one in Brian Kelly's era in Baton Rouge have been reasonably adjusted after that week one loss to Florida State. I think he's obviously has more leeway because of the experience that he has and building winners and having sustainable success. So we'll see that process. I think it's going to take another year or so for Brian Kelly to get in the type of players that can really buy in to what he's selling in Baton Rouge. And on the other side, the big chair is not for everybody. We've seen this a lot of times. A lot of guys get talked up in the process, whether they're coordinator on either side of the ball, offense, defense. And a guy that Marcus Freeman, I look back to and I think about Jimmy Lake, was a guy that a lot of fans at Washington were very, very excited about. And a guy that was replacing a Hall of Famer and Chris Peterson, and a guy that had worked his way up very, very in a way that was easy to him. He went from defensive backs coach to co-defensive coordinator to the defensive coordinator. And then all of a sudden you're sitting in that chair and it's not the same thing. The adversity is a little bit different. Managing people is different. Managing your staff is different. Managing your players is different. So this is a big job. And we look back at Marcus Freeman and the experience that he's had dating back from his time when he was at Kent State to Purdue to Cincinnati and I believe at Ohio State at one point. So there's not a lot there to hang his hat on. And when I watch his post-game press conference after the Marshall game, I think for him, he's trying to talk himself into being a more confident coach. And I think right now it's a little bit, like I mentioned earlier, deer in headlights for him. So I think we're going to learn a lot about Marcus Freeman and Notre Dame staff over the next 4 weeks. And how do they bounce back? And how do you instill that belief into your program? Because listen, the honeymoon period, which was very much alive over the offseason, it doesn't matter until you get to reality and you have to win these games and you have to beat teams like Marshall. That is what you get judged on right now. Marcus Freeman at Notre Dame 0-3. So I'm looking at both of those two places. I think you got to be patient with both of those guys. But definitely in South Bend, I think there's definitely a cause for concern and legitimate concern long-term. Is this the right fit for us? And I think Marcus Freeman has to prove that over the next couple weeks that, hey, I am the guy for the job. But listen, if you're Notre Dame, you had to know that there were going to be some bumps along the way. And I picked the under on Notre Dame. I think it was 8.5 wins. And, there are a lot of people that were very skeptical of that. But I listen, him going up against Ohio State, he's got Clemson coming to Notre Dame. Then he's got to go at USC, who looks like a very good team under Lincoln Riley, not to mention already losing a game that they weren't supposed to lose. I mean, this could be a tough season for Marcus Freeman. I think if you're a Notre Dame fan, you got to adjust your expectations accordingly. But we'll see what happens there for sure. But Drew, that's all I got today, man. Any final thoughts from you?
Oh, no. I mean, just circling back on the Notre Dame thing, I know it's the theme of the show. I just think the marriage between Tommy Rees and Marcus Freeman hasn't been discussed enough. And if you want to learn more about it, Brian Russillo's podcast, he did it back in December. It was about Tommy Rees. He had Tommy Rees on. Tommy Rees talked about choosing between staying at Notre Dame or going to work for Brian Kelly at LSU. I think it's a real eye-opening podcast. I think Jack Swarbrick, the AD there, just wanted to make this all work. And we're seeing right now that, hey, maybe this forced marriage isn't the right thing. Maybe this isn't going to work out. And you mentioned Jimmy Lake, Miami after Mark Richt. They threw Manny Diaz in there. That didn't work out. Sometimes these promotions or the ones that make the most sense from within don't always work out. So that's the last thing I'll say on Notre Dame.
It's early in the Marcus Freeman era, but like I said, there is cause for concern. And like you said about Jimmy Lake and what you said about the Miami hire as well with Manny Diaz, I mean, those are convenient hires for ADs. It's easy to come out and say, hey, we're going to win the press conference and think about the short-term gain and prioritize that over the long-term success of the program. They've struggled with that at Washington. It looks like they got that right with Kalen DeBoer very early there, but that's a point, Drew. You bring up a great point with that. And listen, if you're Notre Dame, there is no NFL talent in your quarterback room, whether that's Tyler Buckner, whether that's Drew Pine, CJ Carr is not coming for another 2 years. So, like, this Dante Moore thing, this Christopher Vizina thing, you find a way to get it done. And if you already missed that opportunity, that can't happen. I know it's year one, but those are the type of things that end up being the cause of you losing your job. So, that's what we got to say on Notre Dame. But Drew, next week, there's a team on Wednesday that we'll be doing a deep dive on, and that is Josh Heupel and the Tennessee Volunteers coming off a really big win at Pittsburgh, and Tennessee looks to be a very much improved team. So make sure you stay tuned for that one. We will be back on Wednesday at 3 o'clock Eastern time. Make sure to join us. And for Andrew Ivins, I'm Cooper Petagna. We'll see you then.